Marcus Chen counted crumpled bills at a convenience store counter at 2 in the morning, coming up short for baby formula, his hands trembling with exhaustion and shame, never knowing that the elderly man in a worn coat standing patiently behind him was Jonathan Pierce, a reclusive billionaire who had spent 5 years testing humanity's kindness after his daughter's death, convinced him that genuine goodness had died with her and that this moment of quiet desperation would shatter both their worlds, proving that sometimes two broken souls find salvation not in wealth or power, but in the unexpected grace of human connection, when a struggling father's dignity meets a lonely man's last desperate search for proof that compassion still exists somewhere deep in the darkness. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Marcus Chen was 28 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of a man twice his age. 8 months had passed since Sarah died, bringing their daughter into the world. 8 months since the light went out of his life, except for the tiny flame that was Emma. The apartment was small, a cramped one-bedroom in the old part of town where the paint peeled like dried tears and the radiator clanked through the night. Marcus slept on the couch when he slept at all, which was rarely more than 3 hours between shifts. Night janitor at the office complex downtown. Morning warehouse work loading trucks until his back screamed. Evening food delivery, driving his dying car through streets he once thought he'd leave behind. 3 jobs, 3 different uniforms hanging on hooks by the door, 3 different ways to barely survive. But Emma was worth every exhausted breath. She was 8 months old now, with Sarah's eyes and Sarah's smile. And when Marcus held her in those stolen moments between shifts, he could almost remember what hope felt like. The convenience store was fluorescent bright at 2 in the morning, harsh and exposing. Marcus approached the counter with the formula clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He set down the crumpled bills he'd been counting in the car. 1s and 5s pulled from different pockets. Different jobs, different pieces of his dignity scattered across the counter. The cashier rang it up. $23.47. Marcus counted again. His card declined with a beep that sounded like failure. He had $18.32, $5 short. $5 between his daughter's hunger and his ability to provide. The shame rose in his throat like bile, hot and bitter. His hands trembled as he touched each bill again, hoping somehow the math would change. Hoping somehow he'd missed something. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Behind him, he felt the presence of someone waiting. Marcus swallowed hard, tasting exhaustion and defeat, but his jaw set with determination. He would not let Emma go hungry. He would give up something, anything, everything, before that happened. The man who called himself John stood 3 feet behind Marcus Chen, watching with eyes that had seen too much and believed in too little. He wore a coat that had once been expensive but was now worn at the edges, deliberately chosen from the back of a closet that held thousands of dollars in unworn clothing. His shoes were scuffed. His posture was stooped. He looked like what he pretended to be, an old man of modest means, invisible to a world that only saw value in youth and wealth. But Jonathan Pierce saw everything. He watched Marcus's hands tremble as they touched each bill, watched the way exhaustion had carved shadows beneath eyes too young to look so old. He saw the calculations happening behind those desperate eyes, the mental arithmetic of survival, the silent question of what could be sacrificed. The baby formula. The young man was short on baby formula. John had been coming to this store for weeks now, always late at night when humanity revealed its truest face. He'd watched countless transactions, staged dozens of small tests, dropped wallets to see who would return them, pretended to struggle with heavy bags to see who would help. Most people walked past. Some laughed. A few stole. For 5 years since Elizabeth died, he'd been searching for proof that genuine kindness still existed somewhere in this cold world. That the goodness his daughter had believed in wasn't just naive fantasy. He'd found nothing but disappointment. But something about this young man was different. Marcus wasn't looking around for help. He wasn't making excuses to the cashier or demanding sympathy. There was dignity in his desperation, a quiet strength in the way he refused to crumble even as his world clearly was. John recognized that look. It was the look of someone fighting not for themselves but for someone they loved more than life itself. He'd worn that same expression once, sitting in hospital rooms, counting minutes instead of money, praying to gods he didn't believe in. His hand moved to his pocket where a worn leather wallet held more cash than most people earned in months. Something stirred in his chest. Something he'd thought died with Elizabeth. Perhaps this was the moment. Perhaps this was the test that mattered. John moved forward with the careful shuffle of an old man who'd perfected the art of being overlooked. His weathered hand placed a $20 bill on the counter beside Marcus's scattered ones, the gesture so quiet it was almost silent. Before Marcus could turn, before surprise could become protest, John was already moving toward the door with that same unhurried shuffle, his worn coat disappearing into the fluorescent night. Marcus spun around, the word wait catching in his throat, but the door was already closing, the bell chiming softly like a whisper of grace. He grabbed the 20, rushed to the entrance, pushed outside into the cold air that bit at his exhausted face. The parking lot was empty except for his own dying car. The stranger had vanished like morning mist, like something Marcus might have imagined if the bill wasn't still clutched in his trembling fingers. He stood there breathing hard, the weight of the money somehow heavier than its paper should allow. Behind him, Rita the cashier called softly. "He does that sometimes." Marcus turned back, walked slowly to the counter where his formula waited. Rita was middle-aged with kind eyes that had seen too many desperate transactions. "That man. I've seen him here before. Late nights mostly. Always in those old clothes. Always alone. Bought groceries for a woman with 3 kids last month. Paid for an elderly man's medication the week before." She rang up the formula, took Marcus's $18, and the 20 handed back change that felt like borrowed time. Never says much, just helps and leaves. Like he's searching for something he can't find. Marcus took the formula and walked to his car in a daze, the transaction complete, but his heart heavy with unpaid debt. The $20 bill had bought Emma's food, but it burned in his conscience like a coal, hot and insistent. He didn't know the stranger's name, didn't know where he lived or how to find him. But Marcus Chen had been raised to believe that debts must be paid, that kindness deserved gratitude, that dignity meant never taking what you couldn't return. He would find this man. Somehow, he would pay him back. This he vowed to the empty night, to his sleeping daughter, to the memory of Sarah who'd taught him that integrity was all a person truly owned. Providence works in mysterious patterns, weaving threads between souls that need finding. Marcus saw John 3 days later at the laundromat on 5th Street, sitting on a plastic chair watching clothes tumble through sudsy windows like tiny storms. The old man looked up when Marcus entered with his basket of Emma's tiny clothes and work uniforms, and something like recognition passed between them, warm and unexpected. "The formula," John said simply, his voice rough like gravel smoothed by river water. "Your baby. She's well?" Marcus felt his throat tighten with gratitude and the weight of unpaid debts. They talked while machines hummed and spun. John learned about Emma, about Sarah, about the 3 jobs that kept Marcus moving through life, like a ghost who'd forgotten how to rest. Night janitor at the office complex, where he cleaned other people's success. Morning warehouse worker loading boxes of things he couldn't afford. Evening food delivery, bringing comfort food to homes that felt nothing like his cramped apartment. John listened with an intensity that suggested every word mattered, his sad eyes never leaving Marcus's face. Then Marcus saw him at Riverside Park on a Sunday afternoon, sitting alone on a bench watching children play, while Emma slept against Marcus's chest in her carrier. John was feeding pigeons from a paper bag, each movement deliberate and slow, like a man trying to remember how to be gentle with living things. They sat together, 2 solitary figures in a world of families, and talked about nothing and everything. The weather, the changing leaves, the way autumn smelled like endings and beginnings all at once. Marcus tried asking about John's life, but the old man deflected with the skill of someone who'd spent years building walls around his history. "I'm retired," was all he'd say. "I had work once. Now I have time. But Marcus saw the sadness that lived behind those words, ancient and deep as ocean trenches. He saw the expensive watch that John tried to hide beneath his frayed sleeve. He saw the way John watched the children with a longing that spoke of irreplaceable loss. The pattern continued through weeks that bled into each other. The grocery store, the bus stop, the library where Marcus sometimes took Emma to escape their apartment's walls. Always John appeared. Alone and watching, infinitely sad and infinitely kind. Like an angel who'd forgotten he had wings. The car died on a Tuesday morning in the warehouse parking lot. Coughing its last mechanical breath with a shudder that felt like prophecy, Marcus turned the key again and again, hearing only the clicking sound of hope running empty, knowing he couldn't afford a tow truck, let alone repairs. He sat with his forehead against the steering wheel. Emma's car seat behind him, a reminder of everything that depended on this failing machine, and felt the edges of his endurance beginning to fray like old rope. Then a tap on the window. John stood there in his worn coat, concern etched across his weathered face like worry carved in stone. "Trouble?" he asked when Marcus rolled down the window. And Marcus almost laughed at the understatement, almost cried at the kindness in those eyes that always seemed to see too much. John knew a mechanic, he said, a good man who might work with Marcus on payment. Marcus hesitated, pride warring with necessity, but Emma needed to get home and he needed to sleep before his next shift. John's car was parked across the street, and Marcus stopped short when he saw it. Not a luxury vehicle exactly, but a newer model sedan, clean and well-maintained. The kind of car that whispered quiet money rather than shouting wealth. The interior smelled like leather and something expensive Marcus couldn't name. They drove through morning streets painted gold with autumn light, and Marcus couldn't help his curiosity. "You said you were retired," he ventured carefully, not wanting to pry but unable to ignore the disconnect between John's worn clothing and this comfortable car. John's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "I used to work in business," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Did well enough to retire comfortably. But comfort and happiness aren't the same thing, are they?" His sleeve rode up slightly, revealing that watch again. The one Marcus had glimpsed before. It was clearly expensive, the kind of timepiece that cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. All gleaming metal and intricate craftsmanship. John noticed Marcus noticing and quickly pulled his sleeve down, a flash of something like embarrassment crossing his face. The first seed of mystery took root in Marcus's mind. Who was this man really? Why did someone who could afford that watch wear clothes from thrift stores? Why did he spend his time alone in laundromats and parks, helping strangers who could never repay him? Marcus said nothing, but the questions bloomed in the silence between them, like flowers growing through concrete cracks. John invited Marcus for coffee at a diner that had seen better decades, the kind of place where the vinyl booths were patched with duct tape, and the coffee came in thick white mugs that had survived 1,000 conversations. They sat by a window streaked with the residue of yesterday's rain, and Marcus cradled his cup like it might warm all the cold places grief had left inside him. Emma slept in her carrier beside them, oblivious to the weight her father carried. The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. Marcus told John about Sarah, about how she'd lit up every room she entered, how her laugh sounded like music he'd never hear again. He told him about the night she died, how he'd been at work, always at work, trying to save money for the baby coming. How the hospital called, and by the time he arrived, she was already slipping away. "I wasn't there," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking around the edges of words too painful to speak. "She needed me, and I was mopping floors in some empty office building. I chose a paycheck over being there when she—" He couldn't finish. His hands trembled around the coffee cup, knuckles white with the effort of holding himself together. I'm terrified every day that I'll fail Emma the same way, that I'll be working when she needs me, that I'll miss the moments that matter because I'm too busy trying to survive. John listened with an intensity that went beyond mere politeness, his eyes holding a recognition that spoke of intimate understanding, of personal knowledge of this particular species of pain. When Marcus finally fell silent, exhausted by confession, John reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over Marcus's trembling one. John said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent learning to speak around grief. Someone who meant everything. And I understand that guilt, that feeling that you should have been there, that somehow you failed them by being human and fallible and unable to control fate. He didn't elaborate, didn't share details, but Marcus saw tears gathering in the old man's eyes, like rain that had been waiting years to fall. In that moment, in that worn diner booth with cheap coffee growing cold between them, something profound shifted. This was no longer stranger helping stranger. This was the beginning of genuine friendship, forged in the shared understanding that some losses reshape your entire soul, that some grief makes you brothers even when blood doesn't. The mechanic delivered the news like a death sentence. The engine was beyond repair, and replacing it would cost more than the car was worth. Marcus stood in the garage bay trying to breathe through the panic rising in his chest like floodwater. The car was gone. His ability to deliver food in the evenings was gone. A third of his income vanished in an instant. The eviction notice came 3 days later, taped to his door like a proclamation of failure. 2 months behind on rent with no way to catch up. Emma's pediatrician had been calling about missed appointments, about vaccinations she needed, about the persistent cough Marcus couldn't afford to have properly checked. Bills covered his tiny kitchen table like accusations, each one a reminder that he was drowning and no amount of working could keep his head above water. He found John at the park on a Thursday afternoon when Marcus should have been sleeping before his night shift but couldn't because his mind wouldn't stop calculating impossible mathematics. John took one look at his face and stood from the bench where he'd been sitting alone. Marcus tried to speak, but the words crumbled into something raw and broken. "I can't do this," he whispered, tears streaming down his face while Emma fussed in her carrier. "I'm working every hour I can, and it's not enough. I'm losing the apartment. I can't feed her properly. I can't afford the doctor. Sarah trusted me to take care of our daughter, and I'm failing. I'm failing her." He collapsed onto the bench, his whole body shaking with exhaustion and despair, all pretense of dignity abandoned. John sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Close enough that Marcus could feel the warmth of another human being who understood. "Let me help," John said simply. "Please, let me help you." But Marcus shook his head violently. "I can't take charity. I can't. It's all I have left, my ability to stand on my own. If I lose that, what am I?" The question hung in the autumn air between them. John was quiet for a long moment, watching leaves fall like gold coins from trees that knew how to let go. Then he asked softly, in a voice that carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, "What if it wasn't charity? What if it was just grace? The kind of grace we all need sometimes. The kind that says being human means accepting help when you've given everything you have." John appeared at Marcus's apartment door 2 days later, carrying a manila folder that looked official and somehow important. Marcus answered with Emma on his hip, the eviction notice visible on the table behind him, his world condensed into cardboard boxes he'd already started packing. "I have a proposal," John said. And something in his voice made Marcus step aside and let him enter. They sat at the small table, scattered with bills and desperation. John opened the folder with careful precision, pulled out papers that looked legitimate and professional. "My former company needs someone for administrative work," he explained, his weathered hands smoothing the documents flat. "Basic filing, organizing digital records, data entry. Nothing complicated, but it needs someone reliable and honest. The hours are flexible, most of it can be done from home. The pay is $30 an hour." Marcus felt his breath catch. $30 an hour for work he could do from home while watching Emma. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. Suspicion warred with the desperate hope that bloomed treacherous in his chest. "Why me?" Marcus asked, His voice edged with the wariness of someone who'd learned that gifts always came with hidden prices. "You barely know me." John met his eyes with that sad, searching gaze that always seemed to see straight through to Marcus's soul. "Because you're honest, because you're reliable, because you wanted to pay back $20 for baby formula even when you had nothing, because my former colleagues need someone they can trust, and I trust you." He slid a business card across the table. The name embossed in simple lettering read Pierce Industries, with a phone number and an address in the business district downtown. Marcus picked it up, turned it over in his fingers. The name meant nothing to him, just another corporation in a city full of them. "This is legitimate?" Marcus asked, hating the suspicion in his voice but unable to silence it. "Completely legitimate," John assured him. "You'd be paid through proper payroll, taxes withheld, everything legal and above board. You can verify everything. Call the number. Look up the company. I'm not offering charity, Marcus. I'm offering employment." Marcus stared at the card, at this lifeline thrown to a drowning man, wanting to believe, but afraid of what believing might cost. But Emma needed food and a roof and medicine, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "I'll need to verify everything," Marcus said slowly. John smiled, sad and understanding. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." Marcus started the job on a Monday morning with Emma playing on a blanket beside his laptop. The work simple and straightforward, just as John had promised. Organizing digital files, creating spreadsheets, updating records that seemed mundane and ordinary. The company appeared small based on the limited documents he accessed, perhaps a consulting firm or modest business venture. Nothing remarkable. He worked diligently, grateful for the flexibility, for the ability to earn money while watching his daughter, for this unexpected grace that had appeared just when he needed it most. Then, in his second week, while organizing a particularly dense folder of archived documents, Marcus accidentally opened the wrong file. Corporate reports flooded his screen. Annual revenue statements, shareholder meeting minutes, acquisition summaries. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible. Billions with a B. Pierce Industries wasn't a small consulting firm. Pierce Industries was a massive multinational corporation with holdings in technology, real estate, manufacturing, ventures that spanned continents and employed tens of thousands of people. Marcus stared at the screen, his heart beginning to pound with a sick, sinking feeling he couldn't quite name. He opened a search engine with trembling fingers and typed 2 words: Jonathan Pierce. The images loaded slowly, each one a small detonation in his chest. A stern man in expensive suits standing before corporate logos. A powerful executive shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. A billionaire philanthropist at charity galas wearing tuxedos that cost more than Marcus's entire year of rent. And the face. The face was John's. Older in some photos, younger in others, always cold and distant with eyes that held no warmth. But unmistakably, undeniably the same man who'd bought him coffee in a cheap diner, who'd sat with him on park benches, who'd worn threadbare coats and pretended to be just another lonely retiree. Marcus felt the room spinning around him, every conversation replayed in his mind with new and terrible context. The worn coat was a costume. The sad loneliness was theater. The friendship was a lie. John wasn't John. He was Jonathan Pierce, a billionaire who'd been playing dress-up in Marcus's poverty, treating his desperation like some kind of social experiment, his struggle like entertainment for a man who'd never known what it meant to count change for baby formula. Betrayal tasted like copper in Marcus's mouth. He'd opened his heart to a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all, just a rich man playing games with people's lives. Marcus found him at the park 3 days later, sitting on their usual bench, as if nothing had changed, as if everything wasn't a lie. He'd left Emma with Rita from the convenience store, needed to do this alone, needed to face the man who'd made a fool of him, without his daughter witnessing her father's humiliation. Jonathan Pierce, Marcus said, the name bitter on his tongue. John looked up, and something in his sad eyes said he'd been expecting this, perhaps even hoping for it. Yes, he said simply. Marcus felt rage rising hot in his throat. How long were you going to keep playing this game? How long was I going to be your pet project, your little experiment in poverty tourism? He threw the resignation letter he'd written onto the bench. I don't need your pity or your tests, or whatever sick entertainment you get from pretending to be human. John stood slowly, and for the first time Marcus saw him straighten fully, saw the powerful man beneath the stooped disguise. It wasn't like that, he said, his voice carrying an anguish that sounded almost genuine. Then what was it like? Marcus demanded. Explain to me how a billionaire pretending to be poor, befriending someone who's actually struggling, isn't the cruelest thing you could possibly do. John's face crumpled with pain that looked real enough to hurt. My daughter Elizabeth died 5 years ago, he said, each word seeming to cost him something vital. She was a social worker, spent her life helping people, believing in human goodness, believing the world was fundamentally kind. She died in a car accident driving to help a family in crisis, 26 years old, and convinced that people were worth saving. Tears streamed down his weathered face. After she died, I couldn't believe what she believed. I became convinced she was naive, that the world had killed her faith, that genuine kindness was extinct. So I started testing people. For 5 years I disguised myself, staged scenarios, searched for proof that authentic goodness still existed somewhere. He met Marcus's eyes with raw desperation. I was losing faith in everything Elizabeth died believing in. I was about to give up entirely. Then I saw you counting change for baby formula, and when I helped you, you didn't see opportunity. You saw obligation. You treated me like a human being worth finding and repaying. You were kind, not because of who I was, but because of who you are. Jonathan's voice grew hollow as he continued, dredging up memories that clearly haunted him like ghosts he couldn't banish. For 5 years, I staged scenarios. I dressed as a homeless man and sat outside my own corporate headquarters. Hundreds of my employees walked past me every day. Some stepped over me. Others mocked me. A few kicked my cup of change across the sidewalk. His hands trembled as he spoke. I pretended to collapse on busy streets. People filmed me with their phones instead of helping. I dropped my wallet in crowded places to see who would return it. Most took the cash and threw the wallet away. One person used my credit cards before I could cancel them. The pain in his eyes was ancient and deep. I pretended to be lost, confused, elderly, and vulnerable. I asked for directions and was ignored. I struggled with heavy bags and was invisible. I went to church services and charity events, places Elizabeth believed were filled with good people, and found only those seeking tax deductions and social status. He sat back down on the bench as if the weight of these memories was too heavy to stand beneath. I tested everyone, rich people, poor people, young and old. I staged hundreds of small moments where kindness could have existed, and I found almost nothing. The world had become exactly what I feared it was. Empty of the goodness my daughter died believing in. Jonathan looked up at Marcus with eyes that held 5 years of accumulated disappointment. I was about to give up completely. I decided Elizabeth was wrong, that humanity wasn't worth her faith, that I should just retreat into my wealth and never trust anyone again. Then I saw you at that store. His voice broke. You were counting change for your child's survival, Marcus. You had nothing. You were exhausted and desperate, and at the end of yourself. And when I helped you, you didn't see an opportunity to exploit. You didn't see a mark or a resource. You saw an obligation to pay me back. You saw me as human. That's what made you different from everyone else I'd tested. You treated me with dignity when you thought I had nothing to offer you except shared humanity. Marcus listened to it all and felt his anger harden into something colder and more final than rage. Disappointment. The kind that settles into bones and changes how you see the world. So I passed your test, he said quietly, each word deliberate and cutting. Congratulations on finding your proof. Your experiment worked. You can go back to your penthouse knowing that somewhere out there, one desperate father treated you like a person. Jonathan reached toward him, but Marcus stepped back. Do you understand what you did to me? I opened my heart to you. I told you about Sarah, about my failures, about my fears. I let you into the most painful parts of my life because I thought we were friends, but we weren't friends, were we? I was a subject, a test case, something you could study and measure and use to validate your theories about humanity. His voice broke, but he pushed through. Kindness isn't something you test, Jonathan. It's not a science experiment where you create controlled conditions and observe results. It's something you live. It's something you give freely without keeping score, without measuring, without turning human connection into data points. He picked up his resignation letter from the bench. You've become so isolated in your grief that you forgot how to simply be human with someone. You forgot that friendship requires vulnerability from both people, not just one. You wanted to observe authentic kindness while being completely inauthentic yourself. Marcus turned to walk away, then stopped. Elizabeth sounds like she was an amazing person, but I don't think she'd recognize what you've become. She believed in helping people, not testing them. She saw humanity as something to nurture, not prove. He left Jonathan sitting alone on that park bench, walked away from the job, and the money, and the complicated mess of their friendship that had never really been a friendship at all. He picked up Emma from Rita's apartment and held her close, breathing in her baby smell, grateful for this one pure thing in a world that suddenly felt even more complicated than before. Behind him, Jonathan Pierce sat alone and understood for the first time that he'd become the very thing he'd been searching to disprove, someone who'd forgotten how to be genuinely kind. Days crawled by like wounded things, each one harder than the last. Marcus returned to his impossible juggling act of 3 jobs, except now he only had 2 since the delivery work required a car he no longer possessed. The math grew even more brutal. He rationed food, ate less so Emma could have more, skipped meals until his hands shook and his vision blurred. The eviction deadline loomed like a guillotine. He'd found a night stocking position at a grocery store to replace some of the lost income. But it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Meanwhile, Jonathan Pierce sat alone in his penthouse 50 floors above the city, surrounded by wealth that suddenly felt like a prison. The view from his floor-to-ceiling windows showed the entire city sparkling like scattered diamonds. Beautiful and cold and impossibly distant, he'd tried to return to his old life, to board meetings and quarterly reports. But Marcus's words echoed in the emptiness. Elizabeth wouldn't recognize what you've become. He looked at the photographs of his daughter that lined his private study, her bright smile, her eyes full of faith in humanity. She'd worked in homeless shelters and crisis centers, had given her time freely, without measuring results or collecting data on human goodness. She'd simply helped because helping was the right thing to do. Jonathan had turned her legacy into an experiment. He'd made kindness transactional, turned vulnerability into variables. He'd been so consumed by his need to prove something that he'd forgotten how to simply be present with another person. Marcus had been right about everything, and that truth sat heavy as stone in Jonathan's chest. Then, on a Friday night, while Marcus was stocking shelves at the grocery store, his phone rang with the one call every parent fears. The neighbor watching Emma said the baby was burning up with fever, wouldn't stop crying, seemed lethargic and unresponsive. Marcus ran. He left his shift without explanation, ran 6 blocks to his apartment building, with his heart hammering terror against his ribs. Emma's skin was fire-hot beneath his trembling fingers. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused. The thermometer read 104 degrees. The hospital was the only option, the emergency room the only choice. Even though Marcus had no health insurance, even though the bills would bury him, even though this single night might cost more than he'd earn in 6 months. None of that mattered. Only Emma mattered. He wrapped her in a blanket and called for a taxi he couldn't afford. The emergency room was fluorescent, bright and sterile cold, filled with the sounds of suffering Marcus tried not to hear. Emma lay on the examination table looking so small and fragile, it made his chest ache with terror. The doctor was kind but clinical, explaining that Emma had a severe bacterial infection requiring IV antibiotics and overnight observation. Marcus heard the words through a fog of fear. Overnight meant admission. Admission meant bills that would eclipse everything he owed, crush him beneath debt he'd spent years trying to escape. The financial counselor appeared with forms and sympathetic eyes that had seen this desperation 1,000 times before. Without insurance, the estimated cost for tonight alone would be $4,000, possibly more depending on tests and treatment. $4,000. Marcus had $63 in his bank account. He sat in the hard plastic chair beside Emma's hospital bed after they'd admitted her, watching her sleep with an IV line taped to her tiny arm, and felt the world closing in around him like walls with no doors. His phone sat heavy in his pocket. He knew one person who could help, one person who could write a check for $4,000 like it was pocket change. Jonathan Pierce was probably sitting in his penthouse right now, surrounded by more money than Marcus would see in 10 lifetimes. But Marcus couldn't. The hurt was too fresh, the betrayal too raw. Calling Jonathan would feel like proving him right, like admitting that kindness was transactional after all, that friendship could be reduced to who had resources when crisis came. So Marcus called Rita instead, his voice breaking as he explained the situation, asking if she knew of any hospital assistance programs or charitable funds. Rita listened with the patience of someone who understood that pride sometimes mattered more than sense. She promised to make some calls, to see what resources existed, told him to stay strong and keep faith. What Rita didn't tell him was that the moment they hung up, she dialed another number, one written on a business card that John had left with her months ago, just in case. Jonathan Pierce answered on the first ring, and Rita's worried voice cut straight through his isolation. "It's Marcus. He needs help. But he's too proud to call you. His baby's in the hospital." Jonathan Pierce arrived at the hospital at midnight wearing his old worn coat and scuffed shoes, looking exactly like John, like the friend Marcus had thought he'd lost. He found Marcus in the pediatric wing, slumped in a chair beside Emma's bed, surrounded by charity care forms and financial assistance applications, his exhaustion etched so deep it looked like it might be permanent. Marcus looked up, and something complicated passed across his face. Hurt and relief tangled together in equal measure. "I'm not here as Jonathan Pierce," John said quietly, standing in the doorway like he was afraid to intrude. "I'm here as your friend. Just John, if you'll let me stay." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded once, a small motion that said more than words could. John entered and pulled up a chair beside him, not offering money or solutions, just presence. He sat through the long night while Marcus filled out endless forms, his weathered hands steady when Marcus's trembled with exhaustion. When Emma woke crying and Marcus was on hold with the hospital's financial assistance office, John stood and carefully lifted the little girl from her bed, cradling her against his shoulder with a tenderness that spoke of old muscle memory, of a father who'd once held his own daughter this way. He swayed gently, humming something soft and wordless, while Marcus watched with tears streaming silently down his face. John made phone calls from the hallway where Marcus couldn't hear, speaking to administrators at charitable foundations that happened to assist families in medical crisis, foundations that bore Elizabeth's name, though he never mentioned that connection. He worked through channels Marcus would never trace back to him, creating pathways for assistance that would feel earned rather than given. He brought coffee from the cafeteria, terrible and bitter but warm. He sat beside Marcus when the night grew darkest, and fear whispered loudest. And he didn't speak about tests or experiments or proof of human goodness. He just stayed. At 3 a.m, Marcus finally broke the silence. "You came." His voice was raw with complicated emotion. John met his eyes with honesty that held no hidden agenda, no measurement, no ulterior motive beyond simple human connection. "You're my friend. Where else would I be?" And in that moment, Marcus understood that this was what genuine friendship looked like, stripped of everything false. Emma improved by morning, the antibiotics working their small miracle through her tiny body. Her fever broke as dawn painted the hospital windows gold, and she opened her eyes clear and focused, reaching for Marcus with the resilient trust that only children possess. The doctor came with good news and discharge papers, pronouncing her well enough to go home with oral medications to complete the treatment. Then came the conversation Marcus had been dreading about payment arrangements and how he would manage the crushing debt. But the financial counselor returned with confusion brightening her tired face, explaining that an anonymous donor had covered the entire bill through the hospital's charitable foundation. Every penny paid. The account settled completely. Marcus felt his throat close with emotion he couldn't name. He knew. Of course he knew. Only one person could have moved that quickly, that quietly, that generously. Jonathan sat beside him looking at his worn shoes, waiting for accusation or anger. But Marcus just reached over and squeezed the old man's shoulder once, a gesture of acknowledgement and something deeper than gratitude. They sat together in Marcus's cramped apartment later that day. Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib. The crisis passed, but the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Jonathan spoke first, his voice carrying the tremor of genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, Marcus. Truly sorry. Not for helping, but for how I approached everything from the beginning. You were right. I treated you like an experiment when you deserved to be treated like a person. I was so lost in my grief, so consumed by my need to prove something about humanity, that I forgot how to simply be human with someone." Tears tracked down his weathered face. Elizabeth would have been ashamed of me. She believed in just showing up for people, in being present without agenda. I turned kindness into a test instead of a gift. Marcus listened to the apology, heard the truth in every broken word, and felt his anger softening into understanding. Grief did strange things to people. It made them build walls and run experiments and forget that vulnerability was the only real bridge between souls. "I forgive you," Marcus said simply, and meant it. "Your daughter died believing in goodness, and you forgot how to believe in anything. I understand that. Sometimes loss makes us strangers to ourselves." Jonathan returned 3 days later with a proposal that felt different from everything that had come before, his eyes holding a clarity that spoke of sleepless nights spent thinking about purpose and legacy. He sat across from Marcus at the small kitchen table, where Emma was having lunch, and he spoke about his daughter with a tenderness that made her real in ways his previous mentions never had. "Elizabeth spent her life helping single parents," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "She worked at crisis centers, connected families with resources, believed that supporting parents meant supporting children's futures. I've been thinking about how to honor that legacy properly, not with tests or experiments, but with genuine help." He pulled out papers that outlined something substantial and real, a foundation in Elizabeth's name dedicated to helping single parents facing exactly what Marcus had faced: child care assistance, emergency funds, job training, healthcare navigation, all the support systems that turned impossible situations into survivable ones. "I want to do this right," Jonathan continued. "Not writing checks from a distance, but building something that actually works, something Elizabeth would have designed herself, and I need you to help me." Marcus felt his skepticism rising protective. "I'm not a charity case you can parade around to prove your foundation works." "No," Jonathan said firmly. "You're a consultant with invaluable lived experience. You understand what single parents need because you've lived it. You know which programs sound good on paper but fail in practice. I need your expertise to build something that actually helps rather than just making wealthy donors feel good about themselves. This would be legitimate employment, competitive salary, benefits, partnership, in the truest sense." The offer hung between them, substantial and genuine. Marcus studied Jonathan's face, searching for hidden agendas or ulterior motives, but found only earnest hope. "I have one condition," Marcus said finally. Jonathan leaned forward, willing to accept anything. "Stop disguising yourself. Stop pretending to be someone you're not. If we're going to do this, you need to start genuinely connecting with people as yourself, not as some character you created." Elizabeth believed in authentic connection. Honor that by being authentic. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, understanding that Marcus was offering him something more valuable than absolution. He was offering him a path back to genuine humanity. Months passed like seasons turning, each one bringing growth that felt miraculous and earned. The Elizabeth Pierce Foundation launched on a crisp October morning, with Jonathan Pierce standing at the podium as himself, no disguise, no costume, just a father honoring his daughter's legacy with trembling hands and honest words. The foundation helped hundreds of single parents in its first 6 months alone, providing emergency childcare when crises hit, connecting families with job training programs that led to real careers, offering healthcare navigation and emergency funds that turned catastrophic situations into manageable challenges. Marcus worked alongside Jonathan, designing programs that actually addressed real needs rather than theoretical ones. His lived experience transforming abstract, charitable concepts into concrete lifelines, Jonathan transformed in ways both visible and profound. He attended foundation events and donor meetings as himself, learning to trust people again without staging tests or searching for hidden motives. He volunteered at the family resource centers the foundation funded, sitting with struggling parents and listening to their stories without measuring or judging, just being present the way Elizabeth had taught him before grief made him forget. The mask of cynicism he'd worn for 5 years slowly crumbled, revealing the man beneath who'd always wanted to believe in human goodness, but had been too afraid of disappointment. Marcus enrolled in night school, working toward the degree he'd abandoned when Sarah got pregnant. The foundation's flexible schedule making education possible again, Emma thrived, growing into a bright-eyed toddler who knew no shortage of love or security, and Jonathan became Uncle John to her. The title given freely by Emma herself when she started talking, a gift more valuable than any wealth he possessed. He taught her to feed pigeons in the park where he and Marcus had once sat as strangers. He attended her second birthday party in Marcus's new apartment, larger now and filled with light, singing off-key and wearing a paper hat without self-consciousness. He was learning what Elizabeth had always known, that the measure of a life wasn't in wealth accumulated or tests passed, but in connections made, in love given freely, in simply showing up for people who needed you. On the 5th anniversary of Elizabeth's death, Jonathan took Marcus to the cemetery where she rested beneath an oak tree that had witnessed too many goodbyes. The autumn leaves fell around them like memories made visible, gold and red and dying beautiful. Jonathan stood before the simple headstone that bore his daughter's name and the dates that contained her too short life, and Marcus stood beside him in respectful silence, giving his friend space to grieve. Then Jonathan spoke, his voice breaking around words he'd never said aloud to anyone. "She died bringing baby formula to a single mother," he whispered, and Marcus felt his breath catch. "There was a woman, a client at the crisis center where Elizabeth worked. Her baby was hungry and she had nothing. Elizabeth left work late that night, stopped at a store to buy formula with her own money. I was driving to deliver it when a drunk driver crossed the median. The parallel hit Marcus like a physical blow. Formula. A hungry baby. A parent with nothing. The exact circumstances of their first meeting, the moment that had changed everything. He felt tears streaming down his face, understanding now why Jonathan had been so profoundly affected by seeing him count change for Emma's formula, why that particular moment of desperation had reached through 5 years of grief and cynicism to touch something Jonathan thought had died. Jonathan turned to Marcus, his weathered face wet with tears. "I spent 5 years trying to prove or disprove what Elizabeth believed about humanity. I tested and measured and searched for evidence of goodness like it was data to be collected, but you showed me what she always knew, what she died demonstrating." His voice shook with the weight of revelation. "Kindness isn't something you prove or test or search for like a scientist hunting evidence. It's something you give freely, expecting nothing in return. It's something you live, not something you validate." Elizabeth brought that formula knowing the mother couldn't pay her back, knowing she'd receive no recognition, knowing it was simply the right thing to do. They stood together before Elizabeth's grave, 2 broken men healing through connection, understanding that sometimes the people we lose teach us the most important lessons through the echoes of their absence. Marcus placed his hand on Jonathan's shoulder, and together they grieved and celebrated a young woman whose legacy lived on not in tests or experiments, but in authentic acts of grace. The Foundation's annual gala filled a ballroom with the kind of people who could write checks that changed lives, and Marcus Chen stood at the podium wearing a suit that fit properly and confidence earned through years of transformation. He told his story to the assembled donors, spoke about counting change at a convenience store counter, about a stranger in a worn coat who offered grace when he needed it most, about how one small act of kindness had rippled outward to create this foundation that now helped thousands of families. Emma sat in the front row, 5 years old now, with her mother's eyes and her father's determination, watching her daddy speak with the unself-conscious pride that only children possess. Beside her sat Jonathan Pierce, no longer hiding behind costumes or cynicism, his weathered face peaceful in a way it hadn't been in years. He watched Marcus with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally found what he'd been searching for. Not through tests or experiments, but through the simple act of opening his heart to genuine friendship. Marcus finished his speech to standing ovation, and as the applause filled the room, Jonathan caught his eye across the crowd and smiled. A real smile that reached all the way to his soul. The foundation had helped 3,000 single parents in the past 4 years. Marcus was 6 months from completing his degree. Jonathan's company had redirected billions towards social good initiatives that Elizabeth would have celebrated. But more than any of these accomplishments, 2 lonely men had found family in each other, had proven that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in connections that transform who we are. One moment of desperation at a convenience store counter. One small act of kindness from a stranger who turned out to be a friend. One friendship built on vulnerability and grace that proved what Elizabeth Pierce had always known. Humanity isn't something you search for in staged tests and carefully controlled experiments. It's something you create through authentic connection, one genuine moment at a time. It lives in the choice to see each other as fully human, to offer help without measuring worthiness, to accept grace without shame. It exists in the space between 2 people who choose to be present for each other, not because of what they can gain, but because of what they can become together. That is the legacy. That is the lesson. That is the truth that turns strangers into family and transforms broken hearts into instruments of hope.